Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines for Wednesday the 16th of August. This is part of our series of programmes that we're recording while our studios are closed for 3 weeks in August. And in this programme we'll be discussing World War II and in particular, did the Holocaust occur on British soil? As the British government has announced, they are launching an inquiry into what happened in the Channel Islands over 80 years ago in reference to concentration camps being built and used on the island of Alderney in the Channel Islands. Regan, I think I was struggling for like a week and a half, knowing that we've had to record 3 pre-recorded programmes to discuss what topics we could discuss and focus on. I mean, we considered looking at the anniversary of the Black Death, so kind of Iranian stories that had emerged as well. But when I saw this headline in the week, it kind of really struck me, because when we look at the Holocaust, we don't even begin to think that this could have actually happened on British soil at all. We think the Holocaust happened on the continent of Europe during the Nazi occupation, concentration camps in Poland and Germany, but we don't begin to think that it's so close at home that we actually then forget about the Nazi occupation of the Channel Islands, and actually what happened during this period of history the British government has now launched an inquiry into what happened with the Nazi occupation of the Channel Islands, but also in particular that this was the only British territory that the Nazis ever controlled.
Well, you're exactly right, Simon, and I think part of the issue is day to day we live our lives here on the mainland of the British Isles, and we can sometimes even forget that the Channel Islands are under our sovereignty, under the control of the United Kingdom. People might go on holiday or whatever, but they do seem in some way removed and distant, and that's our problem. We sometimes treat these islands as if they have a completely separate like an independence from us, when no, they haven't. And even in histories, you often hear people just in popular retellings of the events of World War II speak very proudly of how Nazi Germany did not take any British soil, and it's actually not true. It's not accurate, because they took all of the Channel Islands. And not just did they take all of the Channel Islands, they were practically given to them because they were seen as not having a strategic value, and that it was better to try to evacuate as many people as possible to the mainland and just let the Germans have those islands, and then we could conduct everything from the mainland. I mean, the problem is that there were quite a number of Jews who were deemed inexplicably as unworthy of gaining asylum, essentially taking refuge in the UK, because on the mainland, primarily because they had origins in enemy nations, but they were Jewish. And maybe some of that was because the full scale of the Holocaust that was going on was not really known until a bit later in the war. Maybe the thought was initially that, okay, these are Jews, and we know that Hitler's had some things to say about the Jews, and his whole ideology is built on this nonsense of the Aryan race and whatnot, but they're still German. They still have German origins, and so they could technically be spies. And so it would be dangerous and self-defeating to let these individuals who've settled in these British Isles into the mainland. So no, they can keep themselves to Guernsey and Alderney and whatnot. So unfortunately, as now we're having this review, and as we're looking at the potential for what could have been a massive tragedy on the Channel Islands, there are serious repercussions to that decision to not evacuate.
Yeah, but also for our viewers watching tonight's programme from the Channel Islands, we definitely consider that you are British, that you're part of the British Isles.
You're
and
part of us.
Very proud of being British, as we will discover as we kind of unpack this, what I think is a very significant and important topic.
Absolutely.
So let's start. So we're discussing the Second World War and did the Holocaust occur on British soil, as the British government is launching an inquiry into what happened during the Nazi occupation of the Channel Islands, and remembering again that the Channel Islands were the only territory of the entire British Empire that was ever controlled by the Germans. Britain has never publicly come to terms with or reconciled the part it has played in the Nazi genocide that claimed thousands of lives during the Nazi occupation of the Channel Islands, particularly the island of Alderney. A new government inquiry led by Lord Pickles will look into the change of this by examining what occurred on the Channel Islands during the Nazi occupation. And a new government inquiry will review evidence to establish exactly how many people died during the Nazi occupation of Alderney. Lord Pickles, the UK Special Envoy for Post-Holocaust Studies issues, will lead the inquiry into the full extent of the horrors committed in the concentration camps established on the Channel Islands. The hope is that it will end the considerable speculation about how many prisoners were murdered there, according to the British government. Lord Pickles, quoting about this inquiry, says, "This is about telling the truth." He says, as he's also the head of the UK delegation of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, told residents at a recent meeting in Alderney the unvarnished truth, not for the titillation of others, but because of your own, because it's your own. So it's almost saying that the island of Alderney has to come to terms with its past, or what happened on its territory around 80 years ago.
And you can look and see that the entirety of the Channel Islands really has struggled to come to terms with this. There was no monument to the lives that were known to have been lost until the 90s, whilst we've had monuments for decades here, decades previous. There was no real commemoration or recognition of the tragedy that befell the Channel Islands in that time, or recognition of Nazi occupation for many, many years following. On the 30th of June 1940, the Nazis began their invasion of the Channel Islands, a group of British Crown dependency islands off the coast of France. This was the result of the German invasion of Western Europe. From May of 1940, Nazi troops had been moving west and captured Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France in quick succession, Paris falling to the Germans on the 14th of June of 1940. After the defeat of France, Winston Churchill reluctantly made the decision that British troops should be withdrawn from the Channel Islands and redeployed. It was deemed that their use could be, better found elsewhere. And so the five of these Channel Islands were completely demilitarized. Around 25,000 occupants were also evacuated to Britain, with almost all of Alderney's residents evacuated, along with around half the population of Guernsey and a fifth of the people from Jersey, so a bit less on those islands. Britain suppressed the news that the islands had been demilitarized, and again, this was a strategic move as well. You don't just advertise that because they knew what would be inevitable, and they knew that those left would be suffering, but also the idea, you can see the ignorance of these islands being demilitarized. The Nazis would definitely have been spending time planning, strategizing about how to take these islands on their quest. So they did bomb these islands. They killed 44 islanders on Jersey and Guernsey, and would eventually occupy 4 islands: Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney, and Sark. It was the only British territory to be occupied, but this is often forgot, that there was British territory that was occupied. Before the Battle of Britain commenced in earnest, and before there was that fear of the mainland potentially being taken over, even before you see the horrors of the Blitz on London. We have British soil that has been taken without any resistance, essentially, by the Nazis.
Yeah, well,
and it remained there.
And it made sense from a strategic point of view, because if we see geographically where the Channel Islands are, they're right next to kind of near Cherbourg in northern France, and there is no way that you could actually defend these islands.
No.
I think there was 16, 17 miles off the French coast. So they're not very far. There was no way that you could actually protect these islands from the Nazi kind of invasion. So this was kind of inevitable. At the time, we have to put this in its historical context. So going back to May and June of 1940, we see that the Nazis had carried out the Blitzkrieg. They had, with speed, in a matter of 6 weeks, defeated the Netherlands and occupied the Netherlands, Belgium, and then we saw the encirclement of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, and they were running back to the beaches of Dunkirk, completely surrounded. We thought that here, including French troops and also some Commonwealth or fighters from the Empire, were going to be surrounded, and we would lose 340,000 troops, which would effectively destroy our bid to defend ourselves, because our entire army would be virtually wiped out. We had the miracle of Dunkirk, whereby our soldiers were able to escape. Then we see that that the Nazis controlled Paris. Paris capitulated and surrendered without a shot being fired. Germans took complete control of France. And then, of course, we had the Battle of Britain, where the Germans wanted to gain air superiority, believing that they could wipe out the Royal Air Force. And doing so, this would prepare for the sea invasion of Britain. So within that context, it was imperative to get as many British soldiers back to actually fight and prepare for the defence of the mainland. And of course, they knew that the Channel Islands couldn't be protected.
And for Hitler, occupying the Channel Islands was a massive propaganda coup. He was able to claim that they'd taken British soil. This was able to galvanize people to support the Third Reich. That his vision of supremacy and spreading across all of Europe looked to be coming to fruition in some way, and this would have raised so much more support, even in Germany, even beyond what already was there for the war effort. It would also be an indicator to Britain of what to expect should the Nazis encroach on the mainland. Hitler did believe the Channel Islands could be a stepping stone from which to invade Britain, and you can see how that was there and how that made sense. I mean, they occupied the Channel Islands until the very end of the war. So even as they were losing ground elsewhere, because of the lack of strategic importance from the British standpoint, they were happy to just leave the Channel Islands as it were, and to allow everything to run its course until the very, very end of the conflict. In the summer of 1940, the Operation Sea Lion was launched to invade, to begin the invasion plan of Britain. And the start was to win air superiority and then invade with ships and men. The Battle of Britain was underway from that point. We can see, throughout the following months, essentially, there was going to be these air attacks, and it was an immense and concerning time. And life changed rapidly for the islanders living under occupation. It's important to kind of consider what that meant and what that looked like. Sometimes you hear people say, well, if Hitler had won, we would probably be speaking German here. That may be, that may not be, but certainly the currency was changed on the Channel Islands to the Reichsmark, and everyone, they had to drive on the right-hand side of the road. not the worst of things, but it's certainly that was going to bring the UK into line with German custom there. Entertainment as well changed. Radio was banned, so no good news. No bad news as well on the other side of the coin, but they certainly would have not been able to know in any legal way what was going on the mainland or in the war as a whole, because remember, these islands are being cut off. Essentially, the German perspective is going to be what's forced on them. Cinemas, for instance, would only show German propaganda films, and clocks were changed to continental time. If anyone did break the rules, they faced imprisonment or deportation, sometimes both, to Nazi prisons, labor camps, and concentration camps. With food being rationed for several years as well, towards the end of the war, it became impossible to import food from France, and severe shortages would affect the islanders. During the autumn of 1944, fuel and food supplies were running out. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Finally and thankfully, at the end of December 1944, a Red Cross relief ship, the SS Vega, was allowed to dock on the Channel Islands with food parcels and some medical supplies, which provided a lifeline for, by that time, starving islanders.
And also, I think if you were a German soldier in the Wehrmacht, to actually be posted to the Channel Islands would have been a kind of blessing, because you wouldn't have faced, I mean, like, you know, the alternative then would be posted on the Eastern Front, would have been horrific. Or you posted in kind of North Africa with Rommel's forces to fight against the British in North Africa. I think this would have been a kind of relaxing post, and I think many German soldiers saw this as a kind of like holiday time, that they could actually enjoy that. And there was a really good BBC drama a few years ago called SS Britain. And this was a kind of drama set in what would happen in the likely scenario of the Germans actually invading Britain and taking control of Britain, and what life would have been like under the Nazis. We saw there with Buckingham Palace the Nazi swastika, and over Parliament the Nazi swastika, and they then put in a kind of German king, a king that was favourable to the Germans, and then seeing how life was very, very difficult under Nazi occupation. So in the same way, we actually have this taste of what actually happened for British life under the Nazi occupation during the Channel Islands. But the big question, of course, at the centre of and the focal point of Nazi ideology was the plight of the Jewish people. So the big question is, what happened to the Jewish population living in the Channel Islands?
Well, a small number of Jews lived on the Channel Islands at the time of the invasion. Most were evacuated, but tragically, some were denied access to Britain, primarily because they were classed as enemy aliens, and this, meant they were a part of country. Their origin was in a country in which Britain was at war with. As we've already discussed briefly, there was the worry potentially that some of these could be spies. We'll just leave these individuals on the islands. According to Dominic Lawson, writing in the Daily Mail, the official figure, based on an investigation ordered by the British government at the end of the war, is 8. And this was the conclusion of a 23-year-old intelligence officer, Captain Theodore Panchev, in 1945. But much more recent research by forensic archaeologist Professor Caroline Sturdy-Coles suggests, and this is quite shocking in many ways, far from 8, there were close to 1,000 Jews which perished in the concentration camps set up in Alderney by the SS. Others have speculated on still higher numbers. Many of these would have been French, not native islanders, but transported to the islands and to Alderney from Drancy transit camp in Paris, where tens of thousands of the country's Jewish population were herded with chilling enthusiasm by collaborationists who were part of the Vichy regime. Alderney, though described as Britain's Holocaust island in a powerful report by Martin Bright this month for Index on Censorship, was not the site of an extermination camp. So it didn't have gas chambers. It didn't have some of the normal apparatus you would see or uncover in places like Auschwitz and whatnot. But captives there were worked to death by the SS under the principle described as Vernichtung durch Arbeit, extermination through work. These people then had to remain where they were and live under German occupation. They were registered, they were forced to give up their property and businesses. Some were eventually deported to concentration camps as well. And prisoners of war and inmates from the Neuengamme concentration camp were brought over from Europe as slave laborers to build fortifications and tunnels. In Alderney, the Nazis established 4 camps to hold the prisoners. By 1943, the total number of forced laborers on the island was over 4,000. And there you see a map of Alderney and its concentration camps, the 4 that were noted there. The conditions were unsurprisingly harsh. Many of the prisoners were killed, and there's not an exact number that's ever been uncovered. And so that's why it's important to have this conversation, Simon, and to also bring to light and bring to the public's attention ongoing investigations and reports being drawn up that seek to arrive at some consolidated considerations and expose essentially what occurred on the Channel Islands.
And I think we also have to say that there was a change in policies by the Nazis going into 1943 with the Atlantic defences being built by Hitler right across France, northern France, all the way down to almost to the border of Spain, to protect the Nazi regime from a potential Allied invasion. So part of this was to actually thinking that the British would try to liberate the Channel Islands, and so therefore Hitler invested huge amounts of money and resources in building up a very complicated and complex defence system, as we saw in that one of those pictures there, of huge amounts of money and huge amounts of effort. And of course what they needed was kind of slave labour to actually build these defensive walls across towards the Atlantic, ready in preparation for a kind of Allied invasion of France to begin the liberation of Europe. And this is why so many prisoners of war, particularly Soviet prisoners of war, were actually sent to the Channel Islands in particular to work on these defences for Hitler, and this played a major part. So according to the week's publication Alderney, a 3-mile long island just 10 miles off the coast of France fell under Nazi rule, and the rest of the Channel Islands when the German army occupied France in 1940. Almost all the residents on the island decided to evacuate their homes in June of 1940 and did not return until the end of 1945. The new European writes that when the German occupiers arrived, they operated with impunity on the island, building labour camps and SS-run concentration camps. The only such one was established on British soil. I mean, when we think of the Holocaust and we think of the SS, we think of the concentration camps, we don't begin to actually comprehend or think that there was a concentration camp actually built on British soil. Extraordinary.
No, it goes beyond almost anything that we'll read of in your bog standard historical presentation of what occurred during World War II. I confess, Simon, I've heard very, very little of this previously. There's almost never recognition of what happened. I've not seen any documentary or movie or anything. There was a film a while back, I believe, about some of the challenges faced on Guernsey, but there's been precious little notice given to the plight of the Channel Islands during this time. And I imagine if you were to talk with most born post-war, the claim would be that the Nazis never took any British soil, which is, again, simply not true. Tragically, there was this horror. You can look at it, Simon, war is so complex, and there's strategy, there's decisions made that have to be made for the good of the whole, that are for the bigger picture. It doesn't make it easy for the people suffering in those immediate situations, but the Channel Islands had no strategic importance to the bigger picture, and which is why Winston Churchill made the reluctant decision to try to evacuate as much of the islands as possible.
They did for Hitler as well, and I think it's important to discuss the propaganda value of the Channel Islands.
It was massive for
Firstly,
Hitler.
he can then actually boast that the Germans occupy part of the British Empire, particularly the Channel Islands. They can show what life was like on the Channel Islands and how the British were cooperating with the Nazis. And this is what could happen if the mainland or the British Isles were actually conquered through Operation Sea Lion in the summer of 1940 to the German people. So it had huge strategic value and also kind of mobilizing the kind of morale of the German people, of the German armed forces, to say, look here, we've conquered Britain. We have the Channel Islands.
And to be able to have an additional spot for the concentration camps, for taking individuals they deemed as nuisances from France particularly. It would have been quicker, and separating from the mainland seemed to be a wiser solution if you think about it from a horrible but strategic angle and perspective. And of course, building the fortifications, making up that Atlantic wall, and preparing for the expected invasion of Britain was very, very key to Hitler's plans. It's never been completely clear the kind of prisoners held on Alderney, but this 2020 archeological study suggests the concentration camp called Sylt primarily held prisoners from Soviet territories as well as French Jews, according to a Smithsonian magazine. But as many as 27 different nationalities were thought to have been brought to the island. And so we have now a situation where, with this important report that is being commissioned by Lord Pickles, hopefully there's going to be a little bit more education on insight into what actually happened on the Channel Islands.
No, which is really, really welcomed. Almost 80 years ago to the horror events that happened on the island of Alderney back in 1943. The government is actually producing an inquiry to examine exactly what happened, how many concentration camps were built, and how many were murdered and killed by the SS through extreme work. So it's also important, I think, also to discuss what happened after the war. So we have Madeleine Bunting, revealed in her book called On the German Rule Over the Islands, The Model Occupation. The Judge Advocate's Office, which Whitehall set up to bring Nazi war criminals to justice, declared in a memorandum that all the Alderney inmates were Soviet citizens. So again, we're dealing with historical inaccuracies from the start. So the Foreign Office pronounced that it would be up to the Soviet authorities to decide the fate of the SS men who had worked their citizens to death. And also, I think at the time, there was a change in government. You have to understand, this is when Labour won that landslide election in 1945. It was a socialist government that came in, and its ideology was very much linked to that of the Soviet Union. So therefore, the government of Attlee believed it could establish strong relations with Stalin post the Second World War. And this is why we see a cover-up pretty much in what happened in the Channel Islands, but also a cover-up with what happened with the Soviet occupation of Poland as well. So we see that even this form of justice did not happen, despite Panachev's claim that the commandant of Alderney, Major Karl Hoffmann, had been handed over to the Soviet authorities and executed in Kiev. The British government finally admitted in 1983 that Hoffmann was being held in the UK until 1948, was released to West Germany, where he lived happily ever after, dying in his bed of old age. We see the same was true of SS Humstufe Maximilian List, who run the Alderney camp known as Slilt. Neither was he handed over to the Soviets, as claimed, but was released from a British prisoner of war camp to West Germany. And if you want to understand how deliberately effective the West Germans were in prosecuting such matters, know this, that the Chief of Staff of the first post-war Chancellor, Konrad, if I pronounce his name right, Adenauer, was Hans Goebbels, who had been the chief legal advisor to Adolf Eichmann's Office for Jewish Affairs. That is, Adolf Eichmann, the man responsible for carrying out Hitler's wish that the Jews of Europe should be exterminated, particularly with the Holocaust. And under Goebbels' influence, by 1957, more than 3/4 of the staff of the West German Justice Ministry were ex-members of the Nazi Party. So, I mean, having done a program recently to mark International Holocaust Memorial Day that actually was around 1 million people that are involved in making the Holocaust actually happen. And of those who collaborated with the Nazis, including the Nazis themselves, it was only like 5% were ever prosecuted. So we're looking about 5 or 6, at most 7,000 people brought before the Court of Laws to face prosecution for crimes against humanity. The rest of them were completely let off scot-free. Now, the person that's heading up this government inquiry to look into what happened in the Channel Islands is Lord Pickles. Now, back in January of 2017, I interviewed Lord Pickles in the Foreign Office to mark International Holocaust Memorial Day, and this is my interview with Eric Pickles. Our Prime Minister deserves a lot of credit, and the British government deserves a lot of credit for redefining anti-Semitism and working on the new definition of anti-Semitism that really states that, for example, if you say that Israel has no right to exist, this is anti-Semitic, and if you say that Israel is a racist state, this is also anti-Semitic. Why has the government taken this lead, and why are other countries, including the European Union, very slow to follow Britain's lead in confronting Jew hatred?
Well, we got it through in April in the International Alliance. We adopted it ourselves in this country just before Christmas. I've been talking to some ambassadors outside. They're planning to move this forward. And I think the preaching is this, that people say, actually, we want a holistic approach. We want to treat hatred against Muslims and Jewish people and Christians the same, which absolutely is right, but there is no reason why it has to be all together. I think there is special circumstances with regard to anti-Semitism. I want to see that we deal with anti-Muslim propaganda as well. And I think what we found in dealing with anti-Semitism, an awful lot of Jewish organisations have been very helpful to Muslim organisations, and I think we need to move things along. But I don't think we can afford to operate in the slowest member of the convoy to get everything together because of this. That holistic approach has failed. It has spectacularly failed. And clinging to it as an excuse that we want everything together is just clinging to failure. So that's why I think it's important that we do this. But I'm offended that Jewish people in this country should feel any fear going to the shops. And I have to say I'm equally outraged that Muslim women should be worried about going to the shop, be worried that someone's going to pull off their scarves, be worried that people are going to say unpleasant things. The Jewish community, the Muslim community, and other minorities in this country are welcome, and they are part of our national identity. And without them, we would be the worst. And it's our duty to protect, to reassure, and to allow those communities to flourish.
Well, it's very insightful. Thank you, Simon, for conducting that interview. I'll be some years ago.
I'll definitely look older.
But we do see how things develop, don't we? And that this is an ongoing, relevant conversation that needs to be happening. How Lord Pickles goes from there. Now we see him fronting this investigation, essentially, and we do hope that it finds some answers. What took place on Alderney has been described as one of the darkest episodes in British history. And yet, as such, we do hear precious little about it. Maybe that is because it's one of the darkest episodes. Maybe people just don't like to talk about it and have the awareness of it. I was, when doing some reading around this program, shocked that there was no commemoration or monument or really public event recognizing the tragedy of what happened until the 90s.
Well, I think only now because of an archeological site going back to 2020 really discovered the full extent of a Nazi SS concentration camp on the island of Alderney. So this is actually bringing new evidence to light on what happened, but also I think it doesn't really fit with the British narrative.
Right.
So therefore, we don't want to, on behalf of the British government, and also then focusing on the great victory that we had over the Nazis over 80 years ago during the Second World War, it doesn't fit comfortably with that narrative. We want to talk about, of course, what happened at Dunkirk and the incredible deliverance at Dunkirk. We want to talk about the incredible defence of the realm during the Battle of Britain and the bravery and the courage of the RAF pilots who flew those Spitfires and Hurricanes that defeated the German Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain. We want to talk about the misery that ensued afterwards with the Blitz and the bombings of our major cities, London and Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Cardiff, other cities across the United Kingdom, including Belfast. We want to focus on that. We want to focus particularly on the great victory that we had in North Africa against Rommel's forces and the Battle of Tobruk. We want to then focus on, of course, the D-Day landings that marked the beginning of the end of the Second World War and the Allied start of the Allied liberation of Nazi-occupied Europe. We want to talk about of liberating the Nazi death camps, particularly at Bergen-Belsen and the Soviet Red Army of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and to say, look, this is the reason why we fought in this war, because of the horrors of the Holocaust that took place. But it doesn't kind of fit the kind of British narrative to say that the Holocaust actually happened on British soil. It happened in the island of Alderney, in the Channel Islands. That doesn't fit comfortably. But I think it's important, particularly for those who were murdered by the SS through extreme work, a lack of food, a virtual lack of kind of medical assistance, where over 1,000 prisoners are believed to have died at the hands of the SS. I mean, this is a story that needs to be told, and you're right, we need a kind of monument in Alderney. We need this also taught in our national curriculum as Holocaust studies.
It's part of the story.
It's part of our national curriculum. We need to add this as part of the British history as well. And it's also a reminder as well to our viewers and British history of what the Channel Islands went through. I mean, these are the only people of the whole British Empire that were under Nazi occupation. So we need to hear their voices, their stories of what it was like. I know there's some good documentaries, a few of them on YouTube about this. If you want to research more, you can. There's also that film called the Potato Peel Society, which looked at what life was like in Guernsey under Nazi occupation. So I think the government is doing very well to open this, to bring a closure. But, you know, what's been hidden in darkness needs to come out into the light.
And that's exactly along the lines of what Lord Pickles has said in this investigation. There's an international panel of experts that is going to be reviewing available evidence and will consider the most accurate number of victims for this government inquiry. And Lord Pickles has said the numbers matter because the truth matters. The review is going to put to rest various conspiracy theories about what happened in that period as well. Panchev concentrated on identifiable graves rather than on bodies disposed of in mass pits. So we talked previously about what was highlighted, and the number was what, 8? It was just a small,
9, I think, yeah.
A minuscule number that any discerning individual is going to realize that doesn't pass the test, right? That doesn't really sound accurate. That's certainly not consistent with the toll that we see the Nazis wreaked across any other area of Europe. And you know, there's so many countless individuals who were missing, and from various parts, not just of from these areas, but from France as well. We mentioned the 1,000 Jews who had been rounded up in France as well, likely to have been transported to these camps. So they're looking at the estimated death toll, likely to have been an underestimate, according to the Sunday Times. That estimated death toll that Panchev came up with. His tally of 8 Jewish graves could be significantly inaccurate, and the death toll could be in the thousands. The new inquiry is trying to establish this exact number of people who died on Alderney, and the key question will be the number of Jews who perished. But I mean, this is a process that's going to take time. There's going to be difficulty in establishing the exact number, but hopefully they'll be able to come to some more accurate clarity on what actually took place during those horrible years.
I also have to understand as well what happened to ordinary Jewish people that were not transported to the Channel Islands, that were actually lived on the Channel Islands during the Nazi occupation, and how the German authorities would have rounded up the Jewish residents then. And there's one case particularly of, I think, a Jewish maid working in one particular house that was then sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau from the Channel Islands, from Guernsey. So that's another thing where this inquiry needs to go through and actually look into what happens. I mean, the British government during the Second World War would have been powerless to do that and to actually stop the Nazis at all. There is no way we could have launched an invasion force against the German forces in the Channel Islands to liberate the Channel Islands during the D-Day operations. But what we can do is just reveal this important historical accounts of what actually occurred on the Channel Islands 80 years ago. And this fits in with the Holocaust narrative as well. And so it's a good time to reflect and to remind ourselves of what individual Holocaust survivors went through and sharing their story.
Czechoslovakia was an exemplary democracy in Europe, and the Czechs never thought Adolf Hitler would make a move to invade it. But on March 16, 1939, the Czechs awoke to a new reality.
I opened the radio and heard the president say, "Be all of you quiet, don't fight, don't do anything, the Germans occupied Czechoslovakia."
For teenager Hanna Malka and others like her, life wouldn't be the same.
For the Jews, everything changed. First of all, I couldn't go anymore to school. Then I couldn't speak with my friends, and I was, at my age, the only Jewish girl.
Hanna shared her story with journalists through a social initiative called Zikaron Basalan, Living Room Remembrance. Founded 11 years ago in Israel, it's now in 65 countries, touching some 2 million people. It aims to connect Holocaust survivors with young people.
Then we had to give half of our flat to a Jewish family because the Germans needed flats for the German. After that, we had to go to a small village, and it was very lonely and very, very bad, so my mother sent me to Prague.
In the Czech capital's Jewish quarter, life continued for 2.5 years. Then, in November 1941, Adolf Hitler said he was giving the Jews a city and began transporting them to the Theresienstadt ghetto.
I was living in a flat of Czech family, so we were about 70 people in a 2-room flat with one WC and with one place to wash themselves. For people of our age, it was actually we could manage. We made each other and speak with other. I had always the feeling that everyone there wanted to give the best of himself so that to make other people a little more happy.
Hitler used Theresienstadt for propaganda to deceive the world about what his true intentions were for the Jewish people. The children even put on an opera called Brundibar.
And it said that Brundibar was a bad man who wanted to do bad to them and wanted to send them somewhere, but they were fighting against him, and in the end they succeeded to be the winners.
Older people were deceived into paying money to go to Theresienstadt, thinking they were getting special treatment.
50 people died every day.
And all the time the Nazis were transporting people to Auschwitz in Poland. Eventually, Hannah and the other children were also loaded on a dark cattle car and forced to travel for days without food or water. The notorious Dr. Joseph Mengele was among those greeting them upon their arrival. He chose 200 girls, including Hannah, to be used as laborers and sent everyone else to the gas chambers.
We had to put down everything we wore. We were naked, and they took our hair, not only from the head, but from the body. Everyone got a dress, mostly a summer dress, and we asked where are all the other 1,500 people. And they told us, look to the sky and you see the smoke. These are the 1,500 people.
Hannah and the 200 girls were then sent to Germany, and she spent the rest of the war as a maid or working in a factory for the Germans. According to Hannah, they always tried to guard their humanity.
We wanted to stay people all the time. Maybe we didn't see like people, but we felt like people.
As Germany began to fall, Hannah's life was once again in danger.
They wanted to send us somewhere where they could finish us because they didn't want that the Allies should see what they made from us. But because of all these bombardments, they couldn't do it.
After the war, Hannah returned to Prague, riding halfway on a Russian tank, and life began to return to normal.
And then I didn't want to stay. The Russians came to Czechoslovakia. They were two people. They were the Russians and the Americans. And the Americans were good, but the Russians, not so much to speak about it.
In 1946, Hannah came to pre-state Israel. Like many survivors, she didn't share her story for years. Hannah's granddaughter, Ya'ara Malka, who joins her at events, was a teenager when she first heard her grandmother's story.
But the first time that I realized all the story is when I go with her to Germany. She taught in the schools, and then I got all the picture and understand everything.
Hannah, who will soon be 100 years old, has 2 children, 5 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. After all she went through, she says she wants people to remember, no matter how bad a situation is, there's something or someone good to be found. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Tel Aviv, Israel.
Well, in the midst of much brokenness and tragedy, it is beautiful and heartwarming to see individuals who've survived such tragedy and who have made a properly good go at life and have found security and safety. Of course, the very existence of Israel is a beacon of hope and light to Jews around the world. You know, Simon, occasionally I'll have this conversation, even just very recently with Rachel. I had the conversation that we can't always buy into the language around the Holocaust of never again, because we've seen throughout history attacks upon the Jews. We've seen throughout, right from the beginning, there have been attacks against God's people throughout, but then on the Jews in particular, there's such hatred even in our society. So were something to happen again like this, by God's grace, there's Israel. There wasn't Israel in that formalized nation-state way, and of course, we do have to acknowledge that Britain was not guiltless in its treatment of the Jews in Palestine at the time. So there's now a place of safety and sanctuary for Jews to.
Yeah, I mean, it is the answer to Jew hatred, because this fulfills the dream of Theodor Herzl, who came up with the book, the Judenstaat, the Jewish state, as the solution to anti-Semitism, and how the Jewish people need a country for themselves, their own homeland, where Jewish people are free to be Jewish, to practice the Jewish faith, to go to synagogue, to celebrate the Jewish festivals without fear of attack or persecution, and that Israel is a sanctuary for Jewish people fleeing persecution. But the Jewish state also faces threats from Iran, and the Iranian regime wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, and so therefore, we see again threats of genocide, but in a different way than that was made by the Nazis. Instead, this time by Islamic extremists, whether in Tehran, whether in Damascus or Baghdad, they're still there. And those threats still emerge. But I think the most important thing we can actually learn from what happened during the Second World War and the Nazi occupation of the Channel Islands is saying that this is close to home. This is part of our history. This is a part of British history. Yeah. The fact that we see that the Nazis occupied British sovereign territory during the Second World War should be more widely known, and I definitely think this should be taught in our schools, and hopefully and pray that this inquiry that the government has initiated will actually get to the truth of what happened in the island of Alderney in the Channel Islands, to work out how many Jewish people died, how many Soviet prisoners died, the extent of the SS camps that were on the island of Alderney, and also the experience that the islanders experienced themselves under Nazi occupation as well, needs to be told.
Professor Anthony Glees, the intelligence expert who advised Margaret Thatcher's war crimes inquiry, told The Observer that the inquiry needed to delve more widely into the events on Alderney and uncover the truth about why those responsible were not brought to justice by the British authorities. Lord Pickles said the review will analyse accounts from Alderney hidden in plain sight in archives around the world to uncover the truth, the Washington Post has reported. Now, the findings of the inquiry are due to be published in March 2024. I'm sure if these are revealing in some way, we'll
cover this in March 2024.
Absolutely.
That'll be sure. I think this is something that we need to cover and we need to look into, because we actually do realise that the Holocaust did occur on British soil. There were Nazi SS camps where Jewish people were imprisoned, and where they were forced to work extreme hours on very, very little food, so that they would die of exhaustion, essentially, and lack of nourishment as well, and bad health care. And this is another way that the Nazis decided to actually kill off the Jewish people as well.
For 5 years, the Channel Islands were occupied by Nazi Germany until the very, very end of the war, with regular individuals being shipped over from France, at least 1,000 Jews, as we've already said, but also, you touched on this a little bit, and the details are there. Also, you can see there's some images from the Silt concentration camp, but not only on Alderney, not only on the Channel Islands, some of the individuals, some of the residents of those Channel Islands were then shipped off to mainland Europe, and would have lived and died in concentration camps on the mainland as well, facing extreme torture and horrors that we have heard of, that we've seen in some way brought to screen and in our public knowledge. One of the most beautiful scenes of that film, Schindler's List, it's very poignant. I say it's one of the most beautiful scenes in one way, because you know what follows, but it's right at the very end where the individuals who he's saved, the Jews who have survived, they are no longer fearing Nazi oppression. But the problem is no one else is going to welcome them. And for the viewer who knows the history, they know that, well, Israel is formed in the days immediately after. It was not long, exactly. And so within a short space of time, they would have found a home. But the tragedy was, even in that immediate moment after the fall of Nazi Germany, and as things were beginning to unravel and fall apart, they still didn't have a home. They still were not welcome. They didn't have a place. And that's why I think it's so important that we continue to cover stories like this, that we continue to highlight the ongoing relevance of Israel in relation to events like this. It's why that we need to, as Lord Pickle said, we need to know the numbers because we need to know the truth.
Absolutely, and if you're watching this programme and you're from the Channel Islands, we'd love to hear from you. Maybe you know some stories that need to be told about what happened during the Nazi occupation of the Channel Islands and the island of Alderney in particular. We'd love to hear from you because the more evidence that can be gathered, the greater historical picture that we can have. But I think the Lord is bringing this to light to bring justice for those who were murdered by the Nazis on the Channel Islands. And it's important also to remember that the Holocaust actually happened on British soil over 80 years ago. This is also part of our nation's narrative and history, and this needs to be taught and widely known in our education system. So thank you for watching this edition of Behind the Headlines.